Your brain is not broken. It is running a chemical process scientists only fully mapped in 2022. And it might be the real reason you've spent years calling yourself lazy. What if the laziest people you've ever judged were never lazy at all? Sit with that question for a second, because it's not rhetorical. Most of what gets labeled as laziness has nothing to do with character. It has a biological signature. It shows up on a brain scan. It can be measured, tracked, and predicted. So why does almost nobody talk about it this way? Think about the last time you canceled plans, stared at a task you couldn't start, or scrolled instead of doing the one thing you said you'd do. You probably called that laziness in your head. Almost nobody calls it what the research actually calls it. For decades, there was a simple explanation for why people run out of self-control. Willpower works like a muscle. Use it, and it tires. Rest it, and it recovers. Psychologists called this ego depletion, and for years it shaped how an entire generation understood discipline, motivation, and failure. There was just one problem with it. It barely held up. Why? In 2016, a researcher named Martin Hager led a massive replication attempt, running the exact same depletion experiment across 24 separate labs on 4 continents. If the muscle theory were as solid as it seemed, almost every lab should have found the same effect. Only 2 did. One lab found the opposite result entirely. Doesn't that change how you think about every time you ran out of willpower? Willpower, it turns out, does not drain like a tank running out of fuel. Something else is happening inside you, and that something else explains far more about your exhaustion than any productivity podcast ever has. So, if willpower isn't a fuel tank, what is it? A researcher named Robert Kurzban proposed something called the opportunity cost model. In his view, what feels like running out of self-control is actually your brain constantly weighing one activity against every other available option and slowly shifting its vote toward whichever one looks easier in the moment. Nothing is being depleted. A calculation is happening underneath your awareness, and that calculation can look exactly like laziness from the outside, even though it's closer to an invisible decision than a personal failure. Here are 6 signs that what you've been calling laziness is actually mental exhaustion, wearing a very convincing disguise. The first sign is guilt, not tiredness. Guilt. You sit down to rest, and instead of resting, you spend the entire time mentally listing everything you should be doing instead. That's not relaxation. That's punishment with your eyes closed. Maybe it's a Sunday afternoon. You finally have 2 free hours. Instead of relief, you feel a low hum of dread, a mental tally of unanswered messages running quietly in the background the entire time. Sound familiar? Researchers Fuchsia Sirois and Tim Feichel spent years studying why people delay tasks they already know they should be doing, and their conclusion reshaped how procrastination is understood. It isn't a planning failure. It's an emotional one. You're not avoiding the task itself. You're avoiding the feeling the task creates in you right now, in this exact moment. And your brain, given the choice, will almost always pick relief now over relief later. Why would it choose anything else? That's not weak character. That's a documented pattern in how human emotional regulation works under pressure. So if guilt quietly follows you into every attempt at rest, that's sign 1. Your brain isn't lazy. It's in the middle of a negotiation with itself, and right now, it's losing. The second sign hides inside something that looks like ordinary distraction. Have you ever finished a meeting, sat down to start something completely different, and felt like part of you was still back in that meeting? That's not your imagination. A researcher named Sophie Leroy identified something called attention residue back in 2009. When you leave a task unfinished and move to the next one, a portion of your cognitive focus simply doesn't follow you. It stays behind, still processing, still unresolved. Maybe it's the email you almost sent and didn't. Maybe it's the conversation that ended awkwardly an hour ago. What thread is still open in your mind right now? without you even realizing it. Either way, some part of it stays active inside you, quietly consuming resources the new task needed. What's strange is that the size of the switch barely matters. A massive, unfinished project leaves residue. So does glancing at a notification mid-task and trying to refocus afterward. 10 tiny switches across a day might cost you more usable attention than one long, uninterrupted task ever could. If your mind constantly feels like it's somewhere else, even during things you care about, that's sign 2. You're not unfocused by nature. You're dragging invisible weight from everything you started and never finished. The third sign breaks a rule you'd expect to be true. You'd assume doing less leaves you with more energy. Doesn't that seem obvious? It doesn't always work that way. There's a documented effect called the vigilance decrement, and it shows up in people performing low-effort, monotonous tasks for long stretches of time. In these studies, physiological stress markers actually climb the longer the boredom continues, even though nothing demanding is happening. Think about the last all-staff meeting you sat through without saying a word, or the hour you spent scrolling without really choosing to. What did that hour actually cost you? Nothing about that hour demanded much from you, and yet you ended it feeling strangely heavier, not lighter. Understimulation, in other words, can exhaust you almost as efficiently as overload can. So if you've spent a day doing what looks like nothing and you still end it feeling wiped out, that's sign 3. Boredom isn't the opposite of exhaustion. Sometimes it's exhaustion's other costume. The fourth sign tends to show up in your relationships before it shows up anywhere else. Have small things started setting you off more than they used to? A neuroscientist named Ivanka Savic, working at the Karolinska Institute, scanned the brains of people experiencing occupational burnout and found something specific. The connection between the amygdala, your brain's threat detector, and the medial prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for keeping emotional reactions in check, was measurably weaker. The alarm was still firing on schedule. The brakes simply weren't responding the way they used to. Maybe it's a tone in someone's voice. Maybe it's a slow reply to a text. What was the last small thing that made you react bigger than it deserved? Whatever it is, the size of your reaction stops matching the size of the moment, and that mismatch is data, not drama. If you've snapped at someone over something genuinely small and felt almost confused by your own reaction afterward, that's sign 4. You're not becoming a worse person. Your emotional brakes are temporarily underpowered. The fifth sign is the one almost nobody talks about, because it doesn't look like exhaustion at all. It looks like impulsiveness. When a research team in Paris, led by Matthias Pasiglione, scanned people's brains after a long day of demanding cognitive work, they found something remarkable. A neurotransmitter called glutamate had accumulated in the lateral prefrontal cortex, the exact region responsible for self-control and complicated decisions. The participants with higher glutamate levels made roughly 10% more impulsive choices than those who hadn't been mentally taxed. Could the snack you didn't plan on, or the show you said you'd only watch one episode of, actually be chemistry instead of character? Their brains weren't failing. They were avoiding further activation of a region that was already chemically overloaded. Interestingly, the same biological pattern shows up in overtrained athletes after sustained physical exertion, which suggests mental and physical exhaustion may share a single underlying mechanism, not two separate ones. So if a long, demanding day ends with you making a choice you wouldn't normally make, ordering something you didn't plan on, scrolling instead of starting the thing you meant to start, that's sign 5. That's not a lack of discipline. That's measurable chemistry quietly steering you toward conservation. The sixth sign is the one that should concern you most, because it's the one rest doesn't always fix. Have you ever taken a real break, slept properly, had an actual quiet weekend, and come back feeling like almost nothing changed? This is where ordinary exhaustion starts crossing into something more serious. Savic's research on burnout found measurable changes to brain structure itself, not just brain activity. An enlarged amygdala, thinning across regions of the prefrontal cortex tied to planning and emotional regulation. In follow-up work, some of these changes were still present 1 to 2 years after people considered themselves fully recovered. If the damage can last that long, what does that tell you about just waiting it out? You did the things you were told would fix it. You still came back feeling like a slightly dimmer version of yourself. Burnout, in other words, can outlast the burnout. The brain doesn't always reset the moment the stressful period technically ends. If a weekend off barely moves the needle anymore, that's sign 6. You're not past the point where this can be addressed, but you may be past the point where rest alone is the whole answer. This is the part most videos on this topic skip entirely. They'll tell you to rest more, set boundaries, take a walk, all useful advice. But none of it explains why you got here in the first place. Doesn't that feel like the missing piece you've been looking for? Put all 6 signs side by side, and a pattern starts to emerge that no single sign reveals on its own. Guilt during rest, attention that won't fully arrive anywhere, exhaustion that shows up without any real effort behind it. Emotional reactions sized for a much bigger problem than the one in front of you. Impulsive choices at the end of a demanding day, and a recovery process that no longer fully takes, even when you do everything that's supposed to work. How many of those 6 did you just recognize in yourself? None of that is laziness. Laziness was never an actual diagnosis. It was always a guess made by people, sometimes including you, who couldn't see what was happening underneath the surface. Now you can. That 24 lab study on willpower was never really about discipline. It was about discovering that the model we'd used to judge ourselves for half a century had a crack running through it the entire time. Most of us were never short on willpower. We were operating on a brain that was chemically, structurally, quietly asking us to slow down, and for years we kept mistaking that signal for weakness. None of this means you get a free pass to ignore everything that needs to get done. It means the starting point changes. You stop trying to discipline a problem that was never about discipline, and you start addressing a brain that needs something closer to recovery than punishment. What would change for you if you stopped calling this laziness starting today? That shift alone, just naming what's actually happening, is often the first real progress people make after years of getting nowhere. Your brain was never broken. It was protecting you the whole time,